On this episode of the show, I have with me Jay Chia. He is co-founder at Eventual, and we're going to be talking about how to empower people within your team, especially in a startup environment. We're going to talk about processes, when to add more, and when is the timing right to actually increase some of those formalities, and how much room do you have until you have to step into a problem at a team's dealing with at a startup that is fast growing and obviously has to go through hurdles and learn and gel and grow. We'll ask Jay a little bit about how that balance of feedback and guidance gets done, and hopefully a couple other areas as well. Jay, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
Absolutely. Can you tell us what Eventual does before we dive in?
Yes. So Eventual, we're a company building data systems for AI applications. Particularly, we focus on data that doesn't fit into tables. So if you ever see things like images or video, they don't traditionally fit into like a little database table, and that's the type of data that we focus on, and we let AI systems kind of operate over this data very effectively.
All right, awesome. So this episode we'll be talking about empowering people within a team. So obviously within a startup, things are moving fast. There's only so much time. You as a co-founder have your eyes on many different things. So when we think about the dynamics within a startup team, and when we think about empowering them, I guess let's maybe define that. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty interesting because we've gone from just the two co-founders, right, in a low dingy room in like one of our homes, to a smaller team of like 4 to 5 people, in which I think founder mode is still very easily doable. Not much hierarchy required, and everything can still kind of be very founder led. To now a team of about 20. Where all of a sudden now you do need to like really build that culture of empowerment and letting people run with things. And so I think to me, empowering people is all about like, I think I remember this term, handing off the monkey, right? As a manager, you kind of have that monkey. You're in charge of having the plan, executing against that plan, road mapping, getting everybody else aligned. But if you're at a point where you can take that monkey, the problem and the plan, and kind of hand it off to someone, and so that they can own the plan, they can ask you for resources. That's true empowerment, right? And really give them the full kind of both the responsibility, but also the mandate to go and execute upon it. That's empowerment.
Absolutely. And I guess within a startup, things are moving fast, and you do ask people to jump in, and and there's opportunities as well. If you see something, hey, jump in and try to address it. When you think about that dynamic, some mistakes might be made along the way. Obviously, it's inevitable. How do you balance, the initiative, hey, I'm going to go tackle this, versus making sure the person is capable of going and tackling maybe something they identified?
Yeah. So that's, I would put it in the camp of like initiative, right? That's not necessarily empowerment. Yes, we 100% want people to have initiative and kind of own the problem. But that's not necessarily empowerment, because as an IC, I can see a problem, jump into it. I can be a very good bug fixer, right? But that doesn't really mean that I'm empowered to say, build a new product, right? That's empowerment. I think that's the pinnacle of empowerment, actually, where someone can come in and say, hey, I see a problem that may be tangential, and then really jump in and say, I'm going to take charge of it. And then as a founder, at a certain point, you have to be comfortable trusting people that they see the problems on the ground, they've interacted with the user and customer, and they have their own opinions, and they're almost like trusting in all that context that they've built over the years, right? And I think that word trust is a big part of it, and building that ability to trust someone at that level, right? You're handing off a baby essentially to them. So how do you build that level of trust? And that's over time built by things such as seeing them take initiative, right? Seeing them see these initiatives from start to finish. And then slowly over time, as the trust is built, then I think founders are able to really like give the entire monkey over to their early employees and founding employees.
Absolutely. I love the way you articulated initiative versus empowerment. I'm glad you did, because I firmly believe that the two are separate. I do believe also that society does misconstrue the two. I think there's a blurred line of when people say empowerment, they want initiative and not true empowerment. And I guess when you look at that, and it's tough, right? You're in a startup environment, and this could apply to big company, small company, it doesn't matter. A lot of times people think if they're taking that initiative, hey, I want to be a part of the solution. But as you just said, you have to be at a position to be able to be allowed independently or with some help to go tackle it. Just observing X doesn't mean you're entitled to go fixing X. When you look at that and you kind of think about tempering, you want to give people the opportunity to have initiative. As you said, it builds empowerment because you want that proactive, hey, I'm here and I understand that. But you also have to make sure that, you're putting the right people and empowering the right people to take the right steps. That's a very tricky balance. I guess, how do you promote, can you promote both those cultural aspects at the same time? Do they work hand in hand?
I think so. I think they're not orthogonal. And in fact, they're very complementary, right? However, I do think you need initiative before you can get empowerment. However, I think if you have initiative but you don't give empowerment, that can sometimes be very frustrating for the person, right? Because they will be trying to take an initiative and then they're not kind of like given the mandate to be able to execute upon it. So it really depends at what scope you do it in. And so I think at the very beginning, when, the team, I am fundamentally of the belief that a software team operates actually most effectively when you have one very strong technical opinion in the room and everybody else takes initiative around this technical opinion, right? This technical vision. And so you're able to say, hey, like I see the vision. Here's a part of the vision that I'm going to take initiative in. And then you kind of execute upon that. I think empowerment is kind of one step further, right? Where you're saying that, okay, like I see that there's maybe gaps in the vision and I want to own a big part of really moving this forward. And so then that's where, you can go and ask for permission and say, hey, like maybe ask for permission is actually the wrong word, right? You should be asking actually for presenting that plan and then the founder should really allow people to execute upon that plan. I think one way of really encouraging this is what sometimes people might call rituals, meaning like what rituals do you have in place? Not processes, but like rituals, right? To allow people to do this, right? For example, I think one-on-ones are a very common ritual that people have in place. Like in your one-on-ones, like do you encourage people to speak up and talk, right, and be vulnerable about how they're feeling? And through those conversations, allow people to feel empowered to take actions upon those feelings, right? They might be saying, for example, hey, I've been feeling a little bit demotivated because I see this problem, but I'm not really sure how to go about fixing it. There's like so many steps that need to be done. And so if the people are able to give you as a leader that feedback, then that's where you can kind of empower them and say, hey, why don't you come to me with a plan and I can see what I can do, right? Tell me, do you need me to hire 2 more people to, hop into this with you? Do we need to move resources around so that we're focused as a company and focused as a team? Like, tell me, right? And so I think that's where empowerment really comes in, like letting them feel heard and giving them the resources they need to kind of go out and execute.
Absolutely. I feel as we're talking, we're describing a chair because we keep adding a leg that's kind of complementary because you mentioned vulnerability. And I think it kind of ties back into it's very complementary to being, having initiative, having empowerment, because a lot of times if you are a manager, if you are a founder, if your employees are not vulnerable to really know where they sit with something and they raise their hand, they're setting themselves up for failure without you even realizing. And then as a manager, you need to be super involved and aware of what those gaps are, because I don't want to say imposter syndrome because that's not always the case here, but that vulnerable space so that someone can tell you, hey, you know what? I don't know how to do this, but I really want to. And you said put a plan in place. Fostering that environment, I guess, what have you done or what do you see that works to help provide that environment?
Yeah, I think it's just reciprocating, right? I think creating that space also means that there is space for the founder, the leader of the conversation to also be vulnerable. So I like to encourage vulnerability actually by starting off already being vulnerable, right? Saying like things like, hey, I notice there's some problems in the room. I feel like we, and including myself, can do better, right? I open up that room for vulnerability, and I think people tend to reciprocate, right? Once people know that, hey, like this person's very comfortable being vulnerable with me, I should be able to also be vulnerable with them because they're telling me their deepest, darkest secrets. Not really, but um, they're letting me know their innermost thoughts, right? And let me now reciprocate and make sure that we can have this almost like deeper level, like level 2 conversation. Otherwise, I think most people are, always hovering at that level 1 conversation for their one-on-ones. Like they talk about work progress, they talk about what's going good, what's going bad, but they don't really like dive deeper, right? There's always, I like to call it just the elephants in the room. Like people know that these elephants are in the room, right? They just never really talk about it because sometimes they can be uncomfortable to talk about. So things such as, hey, I think so-and-so is pulling the team down, right? Like those things don't get talked about. Or, hey, I feel like I'm pulling the team down, right? I'm not executing well on a certain part of the project. Those things don't get talked about because it's difficult, right? To kind of admit that as a potentially very high performing individual. It's only when we open up the forum to do this in a conversation that these conversations can really start to happen.
Absolutely. And I guess the other component, the other leg here that we could talk about is accountability. And you mentioned, obviously, you come to me with a plan, put the plan in place. The accountability component, especially if somebody is moving into an area where maybe they're not an expert, they're growing into that area, right? I mean, there might be mistakes, and that's always a fuzzy area because the accountability component is how then it translates into empowerment and initiative. Because if people are scared, no one wants to go take initiative or do anything. It's negative. And then if you're too liberal, then obviously, people have to learn that, yes, there needs to be some learnings from the accountability component. When you define accountability as a mirror to being, having initiative and being empowered, how does that sit within that dynamic?
Yeah, I think a big part of this actually comes down to building a culture of like experimentation. So interestingly, at Eventual, both founders, me and Sammy, we come from very research heavy organizations, right? So I previously came from biotech, and then self-driving, where a lot of the initiatives don't work. Like you try something, it just usually ends up in failure. But that's expected almost. I think that's counter to maybe more product-focused organizations where the deliverables are a lot more solid, right? They're a lot more well-defined. In research, you might go down a certain path and figure out maybe you have to take 2 steps back to make 1 step forward. And so how do you build this culture of allowing people to have their hypotheses, to go out and test it, right? Build something small, test it against the market. I think for us, we've tried to do that by saying, hey, we can build it. You don't need to put it in documentation, but we can put it in the hands of users, right? We'll, Slack some of our closest users and get them to play around with it as long as it's released, right? So lower the barrier of entry, but then also let people know that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to reverse certain decisions, as long as it's in kind of service for moving forward and making progress. So that's number one, I think, allowing people to kind of have the experimentation mindset. I think number two is allowing people to kind of more just ask for forgiveness rather than permission, and like building that kind of a culture, right? Where people are like, yeah, like I have a strong opinion here. I'm going to go ahead and try it out, right? And build it. And then I'm going to come back and like show the team, rather than like always having to ask permission. Like, hey, is it okay if I drop like 1 week of work to do this? Right. I think once you're in that zone, that's where it already gets dangerous. The flip side to that is, hey, like, how do you make sure things still get done, right? In a world where people are just like, yeah, I'm just gonna, solo quest everything, and maybe not even focus on like some of the more kind of operational workloads. And I think that's where just having solid operations comes in, like making sure that like people adhere to a kind of operational cadence, but then also building in that space through the rituals that we talked about earlier, right? How do you build in rituals that, for example, I know some companies do, hey, on Sunday, right, we'll hang out in the office, like come hang out, you don't have to do any work, but we'll build cool things, like just come in. We don't even like code on our regular projects. We just like do whatever, right? So how do you build that space for people to do things outside of the regular operational cadence? I think different companies will have different ways of doing it, but that's, I think, the key part for number 2.
Absolutely. I like that a lot. And I guess as we're kind of talking about this, you mentioned, providing this safe space, being vulnerable. When it comes to how much room as a leader you want to give somebody right before you jump in, again, more art than science, because if you jump in too soon, you choke everything we said. If you wait too long, there's consequences. I feel like you got to be a little bit of a magician here. But in terms of how much room someone should have when they're in this state of, hey, I'm going to go do something a little bit outside of my zone of expertise or my comfort area, how much room do people typically have? I know it's going to be case by case, but generally speaking.
Case by case, but also like how much trust have you built with them? Right? Like there has to have been some sort of history behind working with them in order for you to be able to place that trust. After all, like you want people to be making consequential bets, right? You don't want people to be making these like, I guess, bets that don't matter, right? Because at the end of the day, like you only have so many F's to give. So when people, like choose to bet on something, you want to make sure that if the bet turns out good, it's going to be a step improvement, right? A quantum leap for everyone else on the team. So I think what you do is kind of like make sure that you've built an appropriate level of trust with the individual, and then allow them to run with it insofar as to that amount of trust allows, right? Let's say that you hire a new grad. Obviously, you're not going to let them run with something, and you've only been working with them for a month, right? In our case, we hired actually our first 2 founding engineers were new grads, and so at the start, obviously, you don't let them run amok, but one of them actually ended up building out our entire kind of local, low-level distributed engine from scratch, right? And that's something that after kind of almost a year of working together, we were then able to see their growth and trajectory and also their capabilities. And that's where, with that level of trust in them, and also we saw their capability for execution, right, on certain things. With that level of trust, that's where you can go ahead and give them that much more leeway. And that's where the big bets really pan off, right? I think there's been a lot of talk in the Valley about founder mode and how the founder should be like closely involved with everything. I think that is true for the core products. But also, like, I think as founders, we have to learn how to let our best people do their best work. And founder mode sometimes will mean that we're in the room to help them do their best work rather than like, coding everything ourselves, which is obviously not the right thing to be doing here.
I guess we'll say founder mode for a different topic. That's a whole different can there. But yeah, you obviously articulated that very well. And when you are looking at your team's growth and you're looking at you having more distance between you and some of these facets, right? The culture that you're trying to implement and imprint from as a founder in the first X amount of employees will change. As a founder, how do you keep your eye on that? Like, how are you going to observe the culture that you've imprinted? This idea of I want vulnerable spaces. I want people to take initiative, be empowered, understand where we sit for accountability. As you bring in other managers, they bring in backgrounds and experiences that are from outside the company. How do you protect what's yours? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, and I will say the big caveat here is that it may not be bad to not protect what's yours, right? It may actually be a good thing to take the good parts of what other managers are bringing in and incorporate that into the culture. The example I'll give is, like I said, the 2 founding engineers in our company were new grads, right? And I think we never, at the start at least, we're like, like looking for PMF and you're just like executing. You're not really thinking about culture all that much, right? When you're like 4 people. I mean, it's like 4 people. It's like a little small group. Like what culture, like what values do you really want to instill, right? But over time, as we grew that into like now about 20, it was only very recently that we realized that, hey, like we have kind of a lack of culture, and the reason was because actually we brought in a new manager, our head of engineering. He's amazing, right? And he brought some people out for coffee, and I was like, hey, interestingly, back in my day when I used to work, we used to go out for coffee with coworkers all the time during the workday, right? It was a normal thing. Like I would grab someone from a department that I never worked with and say, hey, what do you do? Let's go out and chat. I'd love to learn more. For a long time, that really didn't happen in our company. And we realized it was because the new grads did not realize that this was a thing that you would do. And it wasn't a fault of theirs, right? It's just they never really learned how to do it. Like they kind of like started working in the era of COVID and, everything was remote and there was just a very different set of expectations around what working was like. And now, given that we're building this company, we never really like recognize that problem, right? So I think number one is being very intentional about recognizing the problems and also recognizing what you want to happen. And then number two, realizing that like sometimes it's just not knowing the problem actually means that, it's no one's fault that this is happening, right? It's just that like no one has their eye on the ball. And so, for example, if we wanted more interactions to be happening within the team, we had to be very cognizant of saying, hey, guys, we want you all to have coffee, right? So literally I went out to the store and I bought a couple of gift cards and I said, if anybody goes out to have coffee with someone else, here's a bunch of gift cards. And now we have like a stack of gift cards just on the table and people love that, right? So it's being very intentional about this and then understanding that when new managers come in, they often bring in a lot of good culture too. I think it's very reductionist to say that, like the only culture that matters is our own, right? Protect our own. I don't think so. I think actually it's really important to, as you bring in new managers, like obviously you have to trust them a lot and you also have to trust the culture and the thinking that they bring into the team and learn how to incorporate that within your existing team to make everyone stronger and better for it.
Absolutely. I love it. Jay, we've covered a lot of ground. I'm sure we've also left a few things we haven't actually covered, or somebody might have a deeper question in mind. Is there a good way of connecting with you and maybe asking you a follow-up?
Yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn or X, Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn pretty easily. Just search Jay Chia, LinkedIn, you'll find me. My Twitter handle is jchia5. Don't ask me why. I just needed to add a number behind it. That's how people can find me and connect with me.
Okay, awesome. I really do appreciate your time. Thank you for being on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right. That's it for the episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. And then two things. One, I think the topic around empowering a team, we actually uncovered a few different legs to that conversation around, initiative, vulnerability, accountability. I thought it was a great discussion. And Jay outlined his thoughts, his philosophies, and where he sees a couple of these things working together. And share this episode with somebody else who might benefit from it. I'd appreciate that. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.